Hi, I'm Jeff Parker, the writer of Future Quest, and you're listening to a podcast named Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
And welcome back to another episode of a podcast named Scooby-Doo, the show that takes a behind-the-scenes peek at this 50-year franchise of monsters, mysteries, and meddling kids through commentary and conversation. I'm your host, Mike Josick. Thanks for joining me. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to be going back to talking to Scooby-Doo people. After a brief digression last two episodes actually, where I spoke to comic book writer and DC Hanna-Barbera first and second wave writer Mark Russell. Mark was responsible for the Flintstones and the Snagglepuss Chronicles, Exit Stage Left. By the way, if you haven't checked out that interview there, I would highly recommend going back and giving it a listen. It was a great conversation, as most of the chats I have with folks on this show are great. But this time around, like I said, we're back to form. We're back to talking to somebody who's worked on the Scooby franchise, and that person is none other than Charles M. Howell. Now, Charles has written quite a bit in animation. He started off at Hanna-Barbera as a young writer and has since written for many shows, including Animaniacs, Pinky and the Brain, and the 7D for Disney. Many of those projects with Tom Ruegger, who he knew from working on Scooby, because Charles wrote for the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo Show, and the new Scooby-Doo Mysteries, as well as the 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo, and A Pup Named Scooby-Doo. Actually, Charles wrote the pilot episode, the first episode of A Pup Named Scooby-Doo, introducing sort of the new format and the new youth paradigm that show featured. I had a really great chat with Charles, and once again, this interview is going to be broken up into two parts. We talk a little bit about Charles's background, we talk about getting into animation, writing for animation. Charles is also an animator, which was an interesting thing to find out. I had no idea. I thought he was just a writer, so that was kind of cool. And as to be expected, we talk about his experience writing for Scooby, Shaggy, Scrappy, Daphne, and occasionally Fred and Velma too. Before we get into the actual conversation, I just want to give a shout out to Conrad Terminus, who many of you might know from the Scooby fan community. He suggested that I speak to Charles and help set up the interview, so big thumbs up. Thanks again, Conrad Terminus. Appreciate the assist. And I don't really have any Scooby news or podcast news to really throw out here, so I'm just going to let her go right into the interview. I'm sure you guys have been chomping at the bit for genuine Scooby material. So without further ado, I'll let you get to the audio, and as always, I will see you on the other side.
Whoa! We hit the jackpot! Yeah, rackpot.
So we're here with Charles Howell, who is a writer on Scooby-Doo for the new Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo series, Pup Named Scooby-Doo, 13 Ghosts of Scooby-Doo. Does that cover it? Did I miss one?
The Scrappy was in it when I started and had been for a couple of years or whatever. I don't really remember what the title was at that point. They were half hours. We'd gone back to a half-hour format, I believe. I don't think we were writing 11 or 12 minutes at that point. I think we were doing half hours. But Scrappy was certainly in it. Yeah, they had just come out of a time where it was only Scooby and Shaggy, and I think we got rid of Scrappy at some point. I don't really remember, but yeah. So it's almost my first writing job. Starting in '82, I did a bunch of them freelance, and then I got hired on staff at Hanna-Barbera, working for Tom Ruegger. Tom and I knew each other going back to the 70s. We were both animators together, basically our first jobs in the industry. And he was the one who said, we've got to write. We've got to write. And in those days, you still had all the old guys from the days of the classic Warner Brothers and Tom and Jerry, MGM cartoons, and Bugs Bunny and all that stuff. Those guys were still working. And I figured, we're not going to write. What are you kidding me? They're writing, and when they die or retire or whatever, it's going to be the generation under them. There was already a whole bunch of people who were, in their 50s. Tom and I were in our 20s, and writing is not going to happen. But he went over to Filmation, got a job as a writer, and I followed him there. And he did quite a bit there. I worked only briefly there as a writer. I also did storyboards and animated there. And then Tom went over to Hanna-Barbera, and I followed him. He hired me to write some Scoobies. So I did, I don't know, a dozen or something in that first year and a half. And then I got hired on staff, I think, for the Snorks was the one that I got hired for. And I don't know, I was there for about 5 years, I guess.
So what was your first exposure to Scooby, like, prior to working with him? Were you a viewer?
Yeah, we used to watch Saturday morning cartoons when I was a kid. I think, I wasn't a little kid when Scooby-Doo, I was about 12, I guess, in what, 68 was it that it came on?
69.
69. Well, okay, so I would have turned 13 in 69. But anyway, I was still watching cartoons because it's what I wanted to do for a living. I went to Cal Arts in their animation program in the 70s when I that was my college. Yeah, so I remember growing up on it.
So you knew at a young age that you wanted to do animation?
Oh, always. What
was the catalyst for that? What kicked you into that?
I liked cartoons. Well, what else? And I did little flip books and all that stuff when I was a kid. So yeah, no, I always liked that stuff. Yeah. So and it worked out. I was working at Hanna-Barbera the summer of my sophomore year in college. The summer after my sophomore year, I got my first job at Hanna-Barbera as an assistant animator. And I guess Tom and I started working there in what would that have been, 79 or 80, and we were both, we shared a cubicle as animators. And what was my catalyst? I just liked cartoons. I liked all the old Bugs Bunny stuff and the Disney features and everything. So yeah, so that's where I was coming from.
And you just kept up with it.
Yeah, ever since I was a little kid, I remember, when I was 8 or something, or 7 or whatever, wanting to be an animator. And there was no home video in those days. I would put a tape recorder. I put the microphone from a tape recorder up next to the TV to record. So that's about the best you could do. And I was trying to figure out how you could get a Super 8 camera and film off the screen, and then have a microphone there. And so I always was interested in that stuff.
So you went to Cal Arts.
Yeah.
You came out, started at
Hanna-Barbera.
Oh, you started at Hanna-Barbera, then you followed Tom to Filmation.
Right.
And then you guys came back to Hanna-Barbera.
Yes. That's
and
right.
that's when you started on Scooby.
I started freelancing. Tom went back to Hanna-Barbera first and got, when he was put in charge of scripts for Scooby, when he was made the head writer, he asked me to do some stuff for him. And then I did a bunch of them, freelance, and eventually went on staff. Writing is kind of, for me, I always wanted to make cartoons, but my family, everybody's a writer in my family. So it's sort of, I didn't really think that was a skill. It's just sort of what you do when you fall out of bed is you write. It's just one of those basic, it's like clipping your toenails or something. It's just what you do.
Right.
But I wanted to make cartoons, and I'm glad it worked its way into writing, because that's a more natural skill for me, I think.
Now, looking at your IMDb, it has you listed as an animator on the Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo show. Is that the assistant job that you were talking about?
No, that was when Tom and I shared a cubicle as animators.
Okay.
So, which would have been like 79.
Yeah.
And then he went over to Filmation right after that and got his first writing job, and I went over there just after that. Okay.
So you were actually animating at Hanna-Barbera prior to leaving, and then you came back as a writer.
As a writer, that's right.
Okay. That's kind of an interesting...
It's all storytelling. at Filmation, I went back and forth between writing, animating, doing storyboards, and so on. And then when I came back and did some of that in between writing freelance scripts for Tom, because the season would be over and there wouldn't be any script assignments. So I'd go back to Filmation and pick up storyboard work, which was always great. I figured, if I can do all these different crafts in this business, I can work year round. Because everything was seasonal in those days. There were just 3 networks, and the shows started in the fall. They started writing scripts in about, February or something. And then the scripts go to the storyboard artists starting sometime in the spring. And then it goes to the animators, and you work as an animator all the way up to the Christmas holidays. The shows start airing in September, but you've got new episodes all the way to, May or something. So I did a little bit of everything.
Well, Filmation would have been a little bit different, too, because they were all in-house, right?
Scripts or...
Animation.
Animation? Everybody was in-house as far as animation goes. I think...
Oh, I thought by that point Hanna-Barbera had started farming out.
They farmed out cells. They had cells done overseas. And they had some... they had freelance people around town. They weren't sending stuff overseas quite yet, I don't think. They were starting to play around with that. It was mostly, in the old days when it was cells, that is the most expensive part of making a cartoon, is painting all those cells. And they'd moved to Xerox by then, so that they didn't have to have inkers, ink the cells. But it still was. But I remember cells being done in house too. But I think they were starting to send stuff over to the mysterious East. I don't really remember.
I think Hanna-Barbera was sending down to Mexico too.
Maybe the union was fighting with them about all that stuff. They wanted to work here as much as possible. And every time the union contract would come up for renewal, suddenly there'd be desks in the hallways, and they'd be like hiring people to do scripts and do this stuff. Look at all these people we're hiring. And then as soon as the contract with the union was over, everybody cleared out, and they employed as few people as possible. But
What was the vibe at the studio like at that time? They've been running for a number of years at that point. They'd had their kind of big shows, and they were doing a lot of licensed shows, like you said, the Snorks and the Smurfs, and
they did whatever they could sell. Yeah, basically the Snorks and the Smurfs, they didn't do a lot. They did mostly original stuff, but the Snorks and the Smurfs, a Belgian comic strip writer named Peyo had developed the Snorks. No, he developed the Smurfs.
Smurfs, yeah.
He didn't have much to do with the Snorks, but it was the same company. It was like the company that handled Peyo's properties around the world. It was trying to make a new thing that was pretty much a ripoff of the Smurfs, but they were underwater. And so that's what I was hired on when I went over to Hanna-Barbera in the mid '80s by that time.
So again, what was the kind of vibe like in the studio? Was it sort of still a hotbed of kind of creativity and activity, or was it a little bit more in the groove and they kind of had their rhythm figured out? And
it was a workplace. Yeah, it was where you went to work. I remember my first summer there. We were all of us assistants, a bunch of new trainees, and I guess I progressed animation pretty quickly because I'd already been to Cal Arts. A lot of the people who were trainee assistants had just come out of art school, and they didn't really know anything about animation yet. But a bunch of us were in this room. We were assistant animators and in-betweeners, and we would see the old timers like Kenny Muse, who had worked on the Tom and Jerry cartoons, in the early '40s. And he would come in there on his walker, and I think he even had one of those oxygen things with the tube under the nose, and he would come in there and he would pick up. I remember I was struggling to do 25 feet a week, which all of us were. That's about what all of us were doing when we started to be animators. But he would come in and do 200 feet. He would come in and 200 feet with the scenes, on his walker with his oxygen tank. And there was one assistant, this guy, I don't know whatever happened to him. He was from Texas. And he was in his 20s, but we were all about the same age. And he would watch Kenny Muse going down the hall, and he would say, "It's the limited animation what's killing him. That's what the limited animation." And he was kind of a character, this guy. I forget his name, but anyway, so we would watch the old timers coming in, and I mean, I remember just thinking, I'm never even going to be an animator. There's so many generations of people ahead of me. But
well, I remember, like, I didn't know too much about Hanna-Barbera other than just the stuff that I watched as a kid until I started doing the podcast. And as well as Scooby-Doo, I kind of cover Hanna-Barbera as well when I can. Just, getting in there and getting my hands dirty and finding out that, like, Mike Maltese and some of those Warner Brothers story guys, like, all the people that funneled into that studio, like, amazing.
Yeah, it was. And Joe was still out selling the shows, and Bill was running the production end of it. They were actively involved through the 80s. Joe was quite a guy, and I don't know how many stories you've heard about Joe Barbera.
Heard a few.
But, yeah, I remember he was going to sell, you might even be able to correct me on this one if I get it wrong. He was trying to sell a show about a big dog that was at a pet store, and it was in the window, and the network said, we're tired of dogs. There are a lot of things. He said, "Did I say a dog? I meant a gorilla." Well, what's its name? Magilla Gorilla. And that's how that show was sold on the spot. Joe could tap dance in front of network executives, or I think actually at that point it was syndication, and they were working for like General Mills or Kellogg's or somebody. Joe was great. I remember having story meetings with him and stuff. He was really great. Bill Hanna was kind of a tough old guy. He watched the pennies, and he did some directing, timing.
Well, he was the guy that kind of kept the wheels moving on production, right? So.
Yeah, but he was also he sang in a barbershop quartet. And he was a kind of character. When I did a feature that ended up being called "Rockin' with Judy Jetson," which was a TV feature, and I wanted to do, I wanted to write the songs, and Hanna-Barbera was famous for not letting you have royalties on songs. Bill primarily would rewrite the songs, and then it would be by Bill Hanna and Hoyt Curtin, who was a music guy, and that was. And when I was starting on this thing, I really wanted to write the lyrics to the songs. And then it goes off to a music person who writes the music. I really wanted to, so I went up to the lawyer there, their head lawyer who was on the premises, and I said, I really want to write these songs, and I will sign away all rights so that Bill doesn't feel he has to rewrite them. And the guy was just. He was just sort of stunned. I guess nobody had ever done that before. But I liked what I was doing, and I was proud of what I did. And so he said, well, okay. And they made up some sort of a thing that I could sign. And I signed it. And then I was writing these songs. God, that script was so long. It was the size of a telephone book by the time it was done. Was it a 2-hour feature? I guess I don't remember.
I talked to Dwayne Poole, and he told me that those scripts were like the half-hour scripts were 60 pages long sometimes.
Right.
Which just stunned me, but I can only imagine what a 2-hour one would be.
You're breaking down all the shots is part of the reason.
Yeah, it's the descriptions, yeah.
Right, and every slug line at the beginning of a shot. But anyway, I wrote these songs, and one day I had written this song that Judy goes and some horrible forces like destroyed this planet with these little furry characters on it. And there's the tiniest one who says, I want my home back. And I don't know why I'm tearing up here. But and Judy said, well, you know what? You don't need the same home. A house full of love is a home. And I wrote these lyrics for this song, and you do scans and whatever, and then it gets sent off to the music people. And one day, Bill Hanna came up and knocked on my door. Now, Bill Hanna had an office downstairs, and you never saw him around the studio. He came up and knocked on my door, and he was crying. And I was like startled. And he said, this song that you wrote, this is great. He wanted to come up and compliment me on the lyrics I'd written for that song. Then he rewrote it all anyway. I mean, Well, it was like he liked it so much that he had to roll up his sleeves and get involved. Sort of a compliment in a way, although I didn't like really the changes in the lyrics he made. But so, these were guys who, and everybody thought of Bill Hanna as like a tough businessman, and he was. That's why you had to sign away your rights to the lyrics and everything. But he was a softie at heart.
So did you have like a background in music at all, or what?
No, I was a writer, and you write with scansion. You write verse, essentially, is what you're writing, and with a good hook line and rhymes, and then it goes off to the. I wasn't doing anything about the composing. I was writing verse.
Right.
That's what a song is. Yeah.
So at that point, were Bill and Joe still fairly hands-on with the studio?
Absolutely. Joe did all the selling.
You saw them very regularly?
Oh, they were there every day, and I had story meetings with Joe. So they were very involved. Bill was mostly in his office. Joe, you had story meetings with. He was more involved in that part of it. Bill was pinching pennies and timing sheets. Maybe he was pinching pennies too, but he was more involved in the logistics of the thing and the business end of it.
It's one of the things that sort of fascinates me about the studio, and it's part of the reason why I'm kind of doing this project too, because like Hanna-Barbera has this reputation with the planned animation and the penny pinching and stuff as just being, it's a factory, and it looked for holes in the market and was like, let's make a show to fill that hole, and they just pumped stuff out. But I mean, the studio itself, Joe and Bill kind of revolutionized that whole, just introducing animation like that to television, and then the creatives that flowed into that place. And when you talk to people, they talk about how it was, it was a workplace, but it was also kind of very familial. And
well, there wouldn't be television animation if it hadn't been for them. Theatrical animation was just going away. Even Disney was suffering. They would do a new feature about every 3 or 4 years, and that was it. And then their features got worse and worse and worse. Everything was, there was no money. So Hanna-Barbera came up with this system of doing limited animation and saved the industry, really. And then what revived it in the late 80s and into the 90s was home video sell-through.
Right.
Suddenly you could, that now everybody does a feature every 6 months or something because there's money. But Bill and Joe saved it for 25 years.
So you said that you were very big on animation as a kid. That's what made you want to go into animation. Were you aware enough of who was actually making the cartoons that you were watching that when you got to an environment like Hanna-Barbera, you knew like who you were working with? Like, were you...
Oh, sure.
Starstruck, I guess, for lack of a better word? I
didn't work that closely. Those big old guys had mostly worked out of the studio. They didn't work in-house.
Oh, okay.
But I was absolutely starstruck. I worked with Friz Freeling somewhat and Tex Avery, and those guys were still around. So I was absolutely starstruck. I certainly knew who Bill and Joe were.
Yeah.
I thought of them in terms of, for television animation at that time in the 60s, they really were doing the best. I remember thinking of Filmation as the cheap place, the inferior place. But Hanna-Barbera was, the good stuff. It was the good television animation in the 60s.
Well, I remember hearing that Lou Scheimer tried, he had a thing about he wanted everything done in the U.S., and that's why they were kind of doing their stuff on the cheap.
Well, he did keep everything here, when I was working for them. I don't know if it ended up that way. At some point, you have to compete,
Yeah.
But he wanted to keep everything here. And so they took animation to a different level. There was a lot of stock animation in their things, scenes that were pre-animated that were used over and over again. The cells and everything were done, like the Lone Ranger on his horse, or the Lone Ranger getting onto his horse, or, whatever. And you would just use those. I think they tried to do 40%. Hanna-Barbera never did that. They had some stock animation, but they never really used it. They did limited animation, but almost every show was done from scratch. They never approached it the way Filmation did. in those days anyway. Everything was done new and fresh. It was limited. It was planned animation, but it was done for each show.
Now, I was going to ask, you've mentioned limited animation a couple times. It's what people usually refer to it as. In Iwo Takamoto's biography, he referred to it as planned animation. He didn't like the limited animation. I was wondering, what was it referred to in-house?
I think everybody in the industry referred to it as limited animation. I mean, but we didn't.
Was it derogatory at the time, or was that something that's just sort of picked up a reputation over the years?
It wasn't derogatory, but it was, we knew we weren't doing Fantasia,
oh, yeah.
So in that sense, it was more inexpensive and all of that. And but no, I mean, it wasn't particularly derogatory, the term, but it was we referred to it as limited animation, although we didn't really. There's no reason to say that every day. You're doing your animation. So, but yeah, it was referred to as limited animation.
So when you started on Scooby, was that just another kind of gig at Hanna-Barbera, or were you like, I'm working on Scooby?
I had, as I said, I had grown up with Scooby, and it was fun. Yeah, I mean, I liked it. The stuff I'd been writing at Filmation, and I wasn't there as a writer very long. My first job was writing at Filmation. My first writing job was writing Filmation, and I think I was there a month. The guy who was in charge of the writing department just kind of hated me. I don't know, it was just a weird vibe, Art Nadell. So I didn't stay in the writing department there very long. And then I went over to animation and storyboards there. But yeah, getting to work on Scooby, I mean, it was still just a job, but it was a show that I knew. It was an entertaining show, I felt. They're really in a bad period at that point, because they had these older directors and stuff. Everything was timed so slowly. And the quality of the drawing, I think, was really going downhill at that. So I feel, I always felt like I can't make this good. I can do a good script, and I really got into the stuff. I mean, I really had fun writing those episodes. But then you'd see what came out the other end, and it was like, oh my God, the production value. There was no production value. But we did what we could with the scripts, and we enjoyed ourselves. We made ourselves laugh, and wrote this stuff. So, it was especially fun writing for Scooby-Doo.
I noticed for the shows that you did work on, the Scooby-related shows, you've only got kind of 2-3 credits sort of per show. Some of them were one, like you wrote the one Pup, and you wrote the one new Scooby-Doo mystery, the Nutcracker Scoob. Was that considered like a staff writing job, that you were on the show, or were those freelance?
The year that I wrote the most Scoobies, and it was over a dozen, was freelance. And then they brought me on staff for the Snorks, but I continued to write Scoobies whenever there was, they kept you working. So the Snorks, when they would have a season break or whatever, I would write for Scooby. But IMDb, they only have a small number of those early animated shows. They just don't have a very good catalog of them. So I know that for a long time, just up until a couple of years ago, you'd look up Animaniacs, and it would say, Steven Spielberg, executive producer, 7 episodes, or something. Well, it was the executive producer for the whole thing. Yeah. But no, it had really gone through, and the stuff that they were putting up on IMDb before IMDb was, the stuff that was done before IMDb came along, they sort of have to go back in time and look for that stuff, and they haven't done it. And so I don't know what it says about my Scoobies on there.
Okay, but
I wrote more than they list.
So for the new Scooby and Scrappy-Doo show, it has you Scooby a la mode and Where's Scooby-Doo. You've got a lot more that season?
God, yeah. Nutcracker Scoob, and it's one that I hate this title, Night Louse at the White House, which was a haunted White House script. And I wrote about a dozen. There was a Showboat Scooby, and I don't know how many of those actually are on IMDb. But
actually, you have 2 credits on IMDb, because you have like Charlie Howell and you have Charles M. Howell.
I had all these different. A couple of years ago, I had like 5 different versions of me on IMDb. There was a Charlie Howell, there was a Charles Howell, whatever. They were all, and I guess they thought that the Charles Howell, who was an animator, must be different from the Charles Howell who was a writer or whatever. And I finally contacted them and I said, these are all me. And so they combined them. Yeah, you get the different, and I combined them. I was Charles M. Howell IV for Animaniacs and Pinky and the Brain. And that's where I got the Emmys. So I said, we put them all under that one because that's what people are going to look for. But it's a little stuffy, Charles M. Howell IV. But that's where everything ended up.
Right. So were the episodes assigned, or did you have to pitch?
Oh, you pitched. You would write premises, and sometimes I'd be there in there with Tom, and we'd say, what about we do this? What about we do that? But then the network had to look at premises and decide which ones they wanted to buy. We wrote one that was at the Statue of Liberty, or I wrote it, when we were doing a parody of Hitchcock's Saboteur, I think is the thing where they climb up into the torch of the Statue of Liberty, whatever. And we did that with Scooby. And originally, that was supposed to be like an around the world kind of thing, like North by Northwest or whatever, where they go to Mount Rushmore, and then the clues would lead them to the Sphinx in Egypt, and then they'd wind up at the Statue of Liberty and everything. And the network said, you know what? Let's just do one of these fully. We were cracking each other up with the whole concept of just going all around to all these different landmarks. And they said, let's just do the Statue of Liberty. So the network had that kind of involvement. Well, we had a great network with ABC. Jenny Trias and Amy Simon. I think they may be the best network people I've ever worked with. They didn't try to micromanage. They liked our stuff. They laughed. Yeah, no, they were really great. But then they'd pitch in and they'd say, why don't you concentrate on this part of this story, or do more of this or whatever. But they didn't micromanage.
So you said the network actually got to choose which episodes got produced?
Oh, yeah. No, you would submit premises to the network, and they would say, oh, we'll take this one and this one. We don't want this one, or whatever. Their premises, like, half a page to a page kind of description of a story, and then, yeah, they would choose. Absolutely.
I've never heard that before.
No, that's always true. That's true on every show done for a network. But, yeah, they would absolutely choose them.
Interesting.
We would generate them, but then they got to pick.
What was the perception of Scooby at the studio at that time? It had already been running for a number of years. I wondered, was it losing its shine, or was it still sort of...
That's why a character like Scrappy-Doo was added. They wanted to have something new. We don't want to have it... the network did. We need to be able to promote this as a new version of Scooby. So it changed every couple of years. But it was a juggernaut. And I was glad that I got to write for those characters. People used to refer to Scrappy-Doo as Crappy-Doo, as people in the studio. And I had fun with him. I liked him. But people sort of resented that these new things had to be added every couple of years. Some people did. I mean, I just took it as it came, and I just it was a fun show to write for in all of its permutations.
And that brings to a close part one of my conversation with Scooby-Doo writer Charles Howell. Just want to thank Charles for being a guest on the show. Super appreciate him taking the time to sit down and have a chat with me. I think Charles has also said he's interested in doing a commentary, so looking forward to maybe setting that up in the near future. Also, again, quick shout out to Conrad Terminus for helping set this up in the first place. Pat yourself on the back, sir. And I also just want to point out that in the time between recording the intro and recording this outro, I have just learned that Harlan Ellison has passed away. Now, for Scooby fans, for anyone who is a Mystery Incorporated viewer, you will know that Harlan made an appearance in 2 episodes of that series. Also happens to be 2 of my favorite episodes of that series. The first being The Shrieking Madness, which was written by Adam Beechin, directed by Kurt Gaeta, featured Chargar Gothicon, and a great H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos spoof parody homage. And in that episode, Harlan Ellison appears as Harlan Ellison. A great guest voice, coming in being himself, apparently knowing Velma's mom, which I'd love to know the backstory to that, but tragically we never will. And Harlan also featured in the finale, the series finale, not season finale. Wow, the season finale of season 2 as well as the series finale, titled Come Undone, which was written by Michael Ryan and directed by Victor Cook. Victor Cook, of course, being guest of the show only a few episodes ago. And spoilers if you haven't seen Mystery Incorporated, but at the end of the series, the gang is kind of standing around, wondering what they're going to do, and Harlan Ellison contacts them, much like Mr. E would contact them throughout the show, and basically says, hey gang, there's like a lot of crazy stuff out there, you should go out and investigate, let's do this. And they go off on kind of the new adventures, which, again, tragically, we never got to see. But it's a great return of a great voice guest, and tragically, we have lost Harlan. On Twitter today, Christine Vallada, under the direction of Ellison's wife Susan, basically asked her to announce that he died in his sleep earlier today. There's a beautiful quote from Harlan saying, for a brief time I was here and for a brief time I mattered. And I think it can be said that despite being cantankerous and combative, Harlan was an incredibly interesting human being. He was a very talented writer. And science fiction and speculative fiction would not be what it is without Harlan's presence in it, and a light has certainly gone out with his passing. And moving on from that somber note, I hope you guys are looking forward to coming back for part 2 of my interview with Charles. I believe it should be coming out... It'll be coming out no later than 2 weeks, but this episode is a little bit later than the bi-weekly schedule I was originally planning. So if I can get it out in a week, I'll get it out in a week and kind of reset that bi-weekly schedule. Otherwise, 2 weeks. No later. But as always, you can keep track on Twitter at Scooby-Doo-Cast. I'm always posting the episodes there and generally trying to keep you guys apprised of what's going on. You can also find me on Facebook. Just search Podcast Named Scooby-Doo on Facebook. Like and follow the page. And I also have the Instagram account, a podcast named Scooby-Doo there as well. There's also the blog, scoobydoocast.wordpress.com. And there's the YouTube channel. And then also, of course, iTunes. All places where you can comment, review, rate, like, follow, share, subscribe. Let me know what you think. You got something to say, you got a request, you got a question. Any of those social media platforms... Oh, and there's also the Gmail account. If it's so infrequently used, I almost never think about it. ScoobyPodcast@gmail.com if you want to send me an email. So let me know what you think. Send me any correspondence through there. And I really don't have anything else, so I'm going to get out of your hair. I look forward to seeing you guys with the next episode. Hope you enjoyed this one. If you liked the Do in part 1, you are going to very much like the Do in part 2. So be sure to come back. And with that... Thank you guys again so much for clicking on the show, listening to the show. I appreciate each and every one of you. Take care, keep fit, play safe, and remember...
Jinkies is not actually a word.
Everybody cheer! This is how we solve the mystery. This is how we solve the mystery. So in summation, this narration is my donation to the art of mystery solving dictation. And here's what the bad guys say when they play where the law forbids.
Would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
This is how we solve the mystery.
Bye.
There's a lot of meddling to do, and a lot of mysteries out there that need solving. Don't miss it!